If you've seen my review of the Waterborne Scorpio Carbon, you know I'm not a big fan of it. However, this Waterborne Gemini is something completely different and I actually really love it. So in this review, I'll break down the Gemini for you and explain why I love it. The first thing I'll cover is just give you a big picture overview of the Gemini and how it rides and feels. Next, I'll go into the technical specs of it. Then I'll go into what I think are the pros and cons of the Gemini. And then I'll finish by taking you on a ride through my local college campus so you can see how the Gemini rides. One of the things I appreciate about Waterborne is that Pat, the founder, is always thinking outside of the box and always innovating. And he was really thinking outside of the box when it comes to these carbon completes. And there are really two things that set these carbon models apart from anything else you've tried. And the first is obviously that they're made with carbon, which makes them extremely flexible. And then the next thing you'll notice about these is that they have very unique, interesting shapes that you haven't seen anywhere else. Now when it comes to this Scorpio model, those two aspects, the flex and the shape of it, don't work for me personally at all. And really what it comes down to is my back foot placement. So you'll see how this narrows at the tail, which means that my toe and my heel are hanging off the side. And if you look at the back here, you'll see that the rail adapter or your riser will go right here, which means that your back foot goes right here on that tail. And since this carbon is very flexible, what happens is when you're standing on this tail, it will flex downward like that, which the net effect for me is when I'm pumping, it actually kind of sucks and drains my energy, and it requires more energy for me to pump. And it actually really tires out my back leg because that flex is absorbing so much of that energy. But with this Gemini model, both the shape and the flex really work for me. So as far as the shape goes, you'll see how he made some innovations on the front and the back cutouts. So you just have really unique shapes on the front and back. And then he also did these cutouts on the rails, which has the effect of both reducing the weight and just adds to the visual effect of this. But even with those innovations, the basic shape of the deck remains, and I still have great foot placement for both my front and my rear feet. And like I said, with this Scorpio model, you'll see how my back foot will hang behind that truck, which makes that carbon flex. But with this Gemini model, your back foot is going to sit right here, which means you don't have that same effect. So what that means is when you flex on this Gemini, it means that that energy really is returning back to the board, and it generates a lot of forward momentum when you pump. So the net effect is that this Gemini has a very bouncy feel, unlike anything that you've ever experienced before. And like I said, that bounce really generates a lot of forward momentum. So with me being a long distance pumper and cruiser, that's one of the main things I love about this Gemini, is that that bounce is really propelling you forward a lot, which makes it great for long distance cruising. First of all, you'll notice that the Gemini is 39 inches long, which I believe is the longest Surfskate I've ever tried. But since it's a drop-through deck with the surf adapter sticking up through the deck, that means that you have about 27 inches of workable space for your foot placement. And so what that means is that the Gemini will pretty much fit any stance width. The wheelbase measured between inner bolt holes is about 22.5 inches wide. So with this wide of a wheelbase, it means that it's not as nimble as shorter surf skates. And if you're short with the narrow stance width, it'll be a little bit more difficult to pump. But the wide wheelbase also means that it generates a lot of forward momentum when you pump. You'll see on the back that they only have 2 holes for the rail adapter. Now, if you wanted to replace the rail adapter with a riser, I imagine you could just drill your own holes. But if you want something a bit stiffer than the rail adapter, my recommendation, instead of drilling new holes for a riser, my recommendation would be to just replace your bushings and make those stiffer if that's what you're looking for. Another thing to note is that the drop-through deck means that this rides just a little bit lower to the ground than a typical deck, so I don't know if you can see that from this angle, but this deck is just a little bit higher than that drop-through deck. Waterborne uses reverse kingpin trucks and these small 63mm wheels on all their complete models in order to avoid wheel bite. But personally, I've never had issues with wheel bite on the Waterborne, even with using traditional kingpin trucks, which are lower to the ground. And you can see that I'm running 70mm wheels on this, no problem. The first pro I would say about it is just that bouncy feel is a whole lot of fun. It's unlike anything you've ever felt or experienced before, and it really is just something that you have to try for yourself to know what I'm talking about. But this board is just a lot of fun. It just feels really great to ride, and it gives you a unique sensation that you're not going to get from any other Surfskate. The next pro of the Gemini for me is that it is fantastic for long distance pumping, which is what I love to do, so it's perfect for me. The return that you get on that energy from the flex of this means that you can jump on this thing and bounce and ride for quite a long time and do it very efficiently without feeling like you're tiring out. And then the final pro I would say is that this carbon deck is extremely durable. I can't imagine you ever breaking it or having issues with it. I think the deck is going to last you forever. As far as the cons go, well, the first thing I would say is that this isn't the most versatile board. It really is a specialized, unique, custom feel that you're not going to get in any other Surfskate. As a non-surfer, I can only assume that the flex and the bounce on this Gemini is not something that you're going to feel on a surfboard. So for that reason, I don't think that it's best for pure surf training unless you're maybe using it for longboard cross-stepping practice. But if that's what you're looking to do, I imagine that a stiffer deck will probably work better for that anyway. The very wide wheelbase and the flexiness also means that you're not going to use the Gemini for bull riding or for really tight, sharp, and nimble riding with a lot of snaps and slides. The next con I'd mention about the Gemini is that these sharp edges of the carbon worry me just a bit. You don't want to have to bail on this board and have this edge hit you in the shins. So one idea I told Pat at Waterborne was that perhaps they could find some kind of a padding that they could put around this edge just to make that a bit safer. But having said that, I've never actually had that happen and been hurt by this, so that may be a complete non-issue. And then the final con for me, and the most obvious one, is the price of this Gemini. So at the time of making this review, you can get a complete model with the standard Waterborne adapter for $499, or you can get a model that has the new fin system on it for $520. So that means that this Gemini model competes with the Spicegate Octo models as the most expensive Surfskates on the market. The challenge for me at that price for a specialized board is that you really have to love this thing to justify the price. And unfortunately, unless you can find a demo board to try, you're not going to know what it feels like before committing to that price. The final note I want to make on the pros and cons here is that on the con side of things, at 39 inches long, this is a pretty bulky board to carry around. But on the pro side of things, this carbon material is actually very light. So at this length, this board is still actually much lighter than decks of much shorter length. So even though it's bulky, it's light, and these cutouts in the rail actually give you nice little carrying handles, so that makes it easy to carry around as well. So I think the best thing that Waterborne could do to market this Gemini is to just have as many demo boards in as many dealerships as possible so people can try this before they invest that money. However, you can actually get just the Gemini deck alone for just $269. So if you are an experienced surf skater and you already have a few Surfskates in your quiver, maybe even a Waterborne with a rail adapter, then that's probably what I'm going to recommend, is to just buy this deck alone and then put together your own complete model. And I have no idea what Waterborne's costs are on these carbon decks, and I'm assuming that they're pretty high, but I wish that there was some way that they could get the price down on these to make them more accessible for a wider range of riders, because this really is a fun board. So I personally love this Gemini, and if you ever get a chance to try it, I highly recommend that you do, because I think that you just might love it too and want to add it to your quiver.